Chapter 1. I heard them laughing before I reached the door. Not the polite, careful laughter men use when they know someone might be listening. This was the other kind. The loose, comfortable kind that only happens when a person believes they are completely alone and completely safe. I was neither of those things standing in that hallway, but they did not know that yet. The west library door sat 3 inches open. Warm firelight pushed through the gap and painted a thin gold line across the stone floor at my feet. I had come to return a report Madden left in our shared suite, the one marked urgent in red ink that he had apparently forgotten the moment Chancellor Marlowe started pouring wine. I stood there holding that report, and I listened to the 3 men I had been bonded to for 6 months discuss me like I was a line item in a budget they were already regretting. Triplet spoke first. His voice carried the easy rhythm of someone performing for an audience he liked. He genuinely believes he is getting a permanent council seat. Laughter. All 3 of them, and Marlowe's underneath like a bass note holding the melody together. Madden's voice came next, quieter but absolutely certain. Baylor was the price of peace. That is all this was. I did not move. My hand on the door frame tightened until my knuckles pulled white, and I made myself breathe through my nose, slow and controlled, because my wolf was screaming at a volume that made my back teeth ache. Black plum and orange peel filled my own lungs, my scent turning sharp and bitter the way it always did when I was trying very hard not to fall apart in a hallway like a person with no other options. Marlowe asked about the bond. Coulter answered. His voice was the quietest of the 3, measured and precise, every word placed like a chess piece. We survived before him, Coulter said. We will survive after. That was the sentence that did it. Not Triplet's mockery. Not Madden's cold reduction of everything I had tried to build here into a transaction. It was Coulter who noticed everything, who had sat beside me in 4 separate supply meetings and understood exactly what I was pointing at in those falsified ledgers before I finished the sentence. Coulter, who I had genuinely believed saw me. He had seen me. He just did not think it mattered. I walked back to our shared suite with my spine straight and my face completely empty. I had learned that expression during the siege, when Ash Ridge's walls were holding but only barely, and showing fear would have cost us the soldiers we still had. It was a useful face. I was grateful for it now. The suite smelled like all 3 of them. Cedar smoke from Madden's side of the room, winter rain from Triplet's coat thrown over the chair he never used for sitting, smoked maple threading through everything from the reading corner where Coulter left his books open and face down like he owned the concept of bookmarks. 6 months of their scents pressed into curtains and rugs, and the embarrassing number of blankets I had quietly accumulated in the corner nest because mountain winters at this elevation were not a personality. They were a threat. I did not take the blankets. I changed into sleeping trousers and a plain gray shirt and stood in front of the mirror for exactly 4 seconds looking at the unfinished mating bracelet on my left wrist. Woven cedar and iron cord, the kind Kincaid alphas presented during a bonding. Madden had placed it there himself, his hands careful and his expression doing something complicated that I had chosen to interpret as sincerity. I chose wrong. I set it on Madden's pillow. Not thrown, not broken. Set down because I was angry, not messy. Then I opened Triplet's wardrobe and stole his heaviest coat, the dark green one with the brass buttons that he wore when he was trying to look like he was not trying. It was warm and it smelled like him, and I was going to wear it out the eastern gate with absolutely 0 guilt because a man who laughs at the idea of you deserving a seat at the table does not get to keep his coat. I reached the door before I realized I only had 1 boot on. I stood there for a long, humbling moment. Dramatic exits were clearly designed by people who planned them. I found the 2nd boot under the bench, pulled it on, tucked the stolen report under my arm purely out of spite and walked out of Kestrel Hall at 4 in the morning the same way I had walked in 6 months ago. Head level, shoulders back, moving like I was going somewhere I chose. The guard at the eastern gate saw Triplet's coat and assumed an Alpha-approved vehicle was waiting beyond the wall. He did not check. They never checked when the coat looked expensive enough. The mountain road was dark and cold, and I could see my breath in short white bursts that disappeared into the black air. My wolf pressed against my ribs, not panicking, just present, which I appreciated. Half a mile from the gate I found my rhythm and stopped thinking about the library and started thinking about the grain route courier I had spotted leaving through the southern gate just before midnight. The man had been carrying a sealed document case marked with Marlowe's private office code, heading north toward the border road at an hour when nothing legitimate needed to move. I filed that information in the part of my brain that kept things for later. Then I heard hooves behind me on the road. Not a carriage. A single horse moving fast, running dark without a lantern. I stepped off the road into the tree line and pressed my back against a pine trunk. The rider passed my position without slowing. Then something cut through the air 2 inches from my left ear and buried itself in the bark directly behind my head. An arrow. I looked at it. Looked at the dark road. My wolf stopped being calm. Chapter 2. I did not run straight. Running straight on an open road against someone on horseback was how people became a tragedy with a brief funeral. I cut left into the tree line and went downhill fast, using the dark and the slope as cover, letting the frozen pine needles bite through my one good boot and the sleeping trousers that were doing absolutely nothing for my survival temperature. Truett's coat was the only reason I still had functional hands. I made a note to steal more of his things going forward, conditionally, depending on whether I lived through the next 20 minutes. The rider pulled off the road above me. I could hear the horse breathing and the slow creak of leather as the man stood in the stirrups trying to find me in the dark below the tree line. I stopped moving. Completely. I controlled my breath down to nothing and tucked my scent behind a full exhale, a technique Ash Ridge scouts used during the early siege months when Kincaid patrols swept the valley. My black plum scent was distinctive enough that a trained wolf could track it through open air. In dense pine with ice fog coming off the slope, it would scatter. The horse moved, not toward me. The rider curved south along the road, which meant he was watching the road, not the slope. Not a trained hunter. A courier turned opportunist, or someone who had been told to make this look accidental. I moved. There was an old rail maintenance tunnel cut into the eastern ridge, sealed during the post-war infrastructure collapse. It was on none of the current maps because the current maps were printed after Marlowe's committee redrew the border infrastructure records. I knew it was there because I had read the original surveys the week after I arrived at Kestrel Hall, before Marlowe's assistant started losing my access requests. The tunnel entrance was overgrown and smelled like ice water and rust and genuinely unhappy rodents. I pulled Truett's coat tighter and crouched inside the first 15 feet where the darkness was complete and the cold had a personality. I sat on a frozen rail tie and I let myself breathe. My hands were shaking. I cataloged that the way I cataloged everything, as data rather than emotion. Hands shaking. Adrenaline. Cold. The psychic weight of having your life quietly dismantled in a single evening. Understandable. Manageable. I pressed both palms flat on my thighs and breathed until the shaking stopped being violent and became merely present. Then I thought about the first time I met them, which was not where I planned to spend a fugitive morning, but my brain apparently had opinions. 6 months ago, Kincaid's army had surrounded Ash Ridge for 11 days. The formal negotiations were happening inside the hall where my father sat at a polished table looking like a man who had already decided the terms. I was outside in the supply yard counting incoming Kincaid wagons and loudly informing their quartermaster sergeant that 4 of his medicine crates were short by 30%, that the shortage was documented, and that if it turned out to be deliberate, I would make sure every border settlement from here to the northern ridge knew which army traveled with contaminated surplus. The sergeant's face went through several stages. Then the 3 of them walked out together and my wolf did something I had no framework for. Cedar smoke and winter rain and smoked maple arrived in the same breath and hit me like a door opened onto a room I had no idea existed. My instincts launched in 3 directions simultaneously, which was as disorienting as it sounds, like trying to follow 3 different songs playing at full volume. I walked directly toward a stone support column before my feet agreed to stop. I redirected smoothly, or at least smoothly enough that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed. Madden noticed. His eyes tracked the redirect with the focused attention of a man who had just identified a variable he had not planned for. Truett noticed and looked like he was about to say something genuinely terrible. Coulter noticed and said nothing, which I would later learn was not indifference but his default method of processing something he found unexpectedly significant. I spoke before any of them could. Do all conquering alphas travel in match sets? Or is this a regional custom I missed in the briefing documents? Triplet made a sound that was almost a laugh before he controlled it. Coulter's mouth shifted in a way that was technically not a smile but was doing its best. Madden looked at me like I was a structural problem he had just discovered in a load-bearing wall. Inconvenient, potentially serious, and absolutely not something he could ignore. I did not allow myself to respond to their sense. Attraction was biological data. It was not an instruction. What I said instead was that I would discuss any bond arrangement after safe food corridors to the 6 affected border settlements were written into the treaty language. Not promised. Written. With penalties. Coulter had asked which 6 settlements I meant. I listed them by name, coordinates, and current deficit. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. More like calibration. Back in the tunnel, in the present, I pulled the assassin's arrow from where I had tucked it against my ribs under the coat. I had grabbed it from the pine bark without thinking, pure evidence instinct. The shaft was smooth, well-made. The fletching dyed dark red the way Ash Ridge military arrows were dressed during the territorial war period. But the dye was wrong. Too uniform. The originals faded unevenly because they were field-applied. This dye had been done in controlled conditions by someone who had studied the originals carefully. A very convincing forgery. I turned the shaft slowly in the dark. At the base of the fletching, pressed into the wood with a stylus so small you would miss it without touch, was a series of notched marks. I recognized the notation system. Kincaid's supply numbering. Marlowe's private office series. Chapter 3. Hollow Creek was 9 miles from the tunnel entrance. I made it in 3 hours on an empty stomach moving through forest paths that had not been maintained since before the war, which meant roots and ice patches and one genuinely personal moment with a low branch that I did not see until after. The settlement sat in a river fold below the ridge, 8 or 9 buildings grouped around a mill that was still turning despite everything, which I respected enormously. Smoke from 2 chimneys, laundry frozen stiff on a line. A child sitting on a fence post watching me come down the tree line with the calm, unsettling stare that children in struggling communities develop when strangers stop being surprising. I raised one hand in greeting. The child did not wave back. Solid threat assessment. A woman came out of the mill door before I reached the yard. She was somewhere past 50, compact and weathered, with the kind of face that had been making difficult decisions for so long it had simply become the face's resting position. She looked at Triplet's expensive coat, then at my sleeping trousers and single visibly traumatized boot, and the entire evaluation took about 2 seconds. "You are either lost or important," she said. "Neither," I said. "I am Baylor Quinn. I used to be someone's peace offering and I have reason to believe your settlement's relief shipments are being stolen." She looked at me for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "There is nothing to eat but I have hot water." Her name was Hollis Crane. She ran the mill and the informal record-keeping system for 4 surrounding settlements, which meant she was essentially the government as far as anyone on the ground was concerned. The official government had not been meaningfully present since autumn. The inside of the mill was clean and organized and cold in the specific way that happens when fuel is being rationed. A group of elderly wolves shared a bench near the smallest fire I had seen used for heating purposes. 2 children were splitting what appeared to be a single portion of boiled root between them with the serious fairness of people who had been doing this long enough to have a system. I kept my face neutral. Hollis laid the settlement's supply ledger on the work table without me asking. She had been waiting for someone to look at it. She just had not believed anyone who mattered would come. I read the ledger standing up. Took me 11 minutes. What I found was not complicated. It was the opposite of complicated. Whoever had designed this theft had done it simply and repeatedly, betting that no one with sufficient authority would ever sit down with the actual numbers. The settlements had been signing delivery receipts for full shipments. The physical deliveries were 30 to 50% short. The discrepancy was being absorbed into a secondary ledger that routed the surplus grain to coordinates that did not correspond to any official depot on the current territorial maps. But they corresponded exactly to 3 locations on the original Prairie Draw survey maps I had memorized during my first week at Kestrel Hall. The theft had been running for at least 14 months. Predated my arrival. Predated the peace treaty. Marlowe had built this before the war ended, which meant he had never intended the peace to hold. He had built infrastructure for a second conflict while negotiating the first one to a close. I told Hollis what I had found. All of it without softening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will you run now that you know?" "No," I said. "I am going to be extremely irritating about it instead." I spent the next 4 hours reorganizing. I used the blank pages at the back of the ledger to draft emergency cart routes between Hollow Creek and 3 neighboring settlements, cross-referencing their individual stores so that the shortfall in protein could be offset by the surplus of preserved grain 2 valleys over. Hollis knew exactly which families had transportation and which settlement elders had the authority to approve temporary exchanges without waiting for official channels that had clearly stopped working. I asked questions and wrote down the answers and turned the answers into logistics. By midday, 2 carts were moving. Outside, I could see evidence of the triplet search without seeing the triplets themselves. A pair of Kincaid riders questioned the old man at the settlement's northern edge about strangers on the road. The riders were professional and polite and offered a reward sum that suggested genuine desperation rather than a standard missing person inquiry. Hollis watched them through the window. "Your mates?" she asked. "My former contractual obligations," I said. "Hand me that red ink." What I was building, settlement by settlement, was a paper record of the entire theft system. Signed receipts versus actual delivery. Route numbers versus real coordinates. If I could get the documentation to enough separate hands before Marlowe realized what I was doing, burning one archive would not be sufficient. That was the strategy. It was a good strategy. I was feeling reasonably confident about it until Hollis set a child's drawing on the table beside my work and said nothing. The drawing showed a grain wagon. On the side of the wagon, in the careful block letters of a child who had recently learned to write, was a name. The name was my father's. Jory Quinn. Ash Ridge pack crest drawn carefully beside it in brown crayon. I looked at the drawing. I looked at Hollis. "Where did this child see that wagon?" I asked. Hollis said, 3 months ago. Same week the short delivery started. Chapter 4. I did not sleep. I worked through the night in Hollis's mill by the light of a single candle that she replaced twice without being asked. The quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that some problems required uninterrupted time and that offering food was useless when a person's jaw was set the way mine was. I pulled every record Hollis had accumulated across 14 months of careful, angry documentation, and I laid them against the route numbers from the arrow shaft and the coordinates from the Prairie Draw survey maps, and I built the complete picture on the back of a feed inventory sheet because it was the largest blank paper in the building. By the 3rd hour, the picture was worse than I had thought. By the 5th hour, I understood that I had been brought to Kestrel Hall specifically because someone expected me to fail. The contracts were layered. Jory Quinn, my father, the alpha of Ash Ridge who had surrendered to the Kincaid triplets and offered his only son in a bonding agreement to secure the peace, had signed the first fraudulent diversion orders 16 months ago. Not under duress. Not through deception. He had signed them with full knowledge of the secondary ledger system and had received quarterly payments into an account registered under a supply cooperative that existed on paper only. He had prolonged the war, not by months, by a full year. Every family in Ash Ridge who lost someone in that final year, every wolf buried in the cold ground while my father sat at a polished table discussing peace terms, had died for a mineral corridor access agreement and a 12% share of emergency relief contracts. I sat with that for exactly the time it took the candle to burn down half an inch. Then I kept working, because the grief was real and I would feel it completely later, when feeling it completely would not get anyone killed. Right now it was data the same way my shaking hands were data, and I needed the data to be useful. The marriage arrangement served 3 purposes that had nothing to do with peace. The first was ending the war before territorial auditors could examine the combined financial records of both packs. A bonding agreement collapsed independent auditing rights under joint territory law, which meant Kincaid could not investigate Ash Ridge accounts and Ash Ridge could not investigate Kincaid accounts without mutual consent. My father knew the Kincaid brothers would never consent to an investigation that revealed their own chancellor's financial corruption. Marlowe had made certain of that by feeding them a controlled stream of information for years. The second purpose was land access. A completed mating bond between me and the triplets would eventually transfer secondary inheritance rights over Ash Ridge's eastern mountain corridor to the Kincaid Line. The corridor contained mineral deposits large enough to fund either a war or a dynasty, depending on who controlled the extraction contracts. Marlowe had already drafted those contracts. My father had already signed his portion. All they needed was a completed bond. I was the signature they were waiting for. The third purpose was insurance. If the fraud was ever discovered, the evidence trail had been constructed to point at me. My identification codes, the ones assigned to me during the peace negotiation period as a junior treaty representative, appeared on the authorization headers of 6 early diversion orders. Someone had studied my signature closely enough to reproduce it on documents dated before I ever set foot in Kincaid territory. Marlowe had built me as the exit. The forged letters warning the triplets that I intended to poison them and seize their territory for Ash Ridge were not a spontaneous decision. They were the activation of a contingency that had been prepared months in advance, waiting for the moment when someone inside Kestrel Hall got close enough to the real records to become dangerous. That moment was apparently me discovering the falsified ledgers in my second month and telling Coulter directly, clearly, and in front of 2 witnesses that the grain routes were being manipulated. Coulter had listened. Coulter had understood. Coulter had said nothing. I closed the feed inventory sheet carefully and tied it with a cord from a hanging bundle of dried herbs. Hollis handed me a cup of hot water and sat down across the table. "Bad?" she said. "Comprehensive," I said. At dawn, I joined the settlement's morning work rotation because standing still while furious was a waste of everyone's time, including my own. I helped shift grain sacks, checked axle integrity on the 2 community carts, and assisted a teenage wolf named Perry with a supply manifest that he was managing by memory because no one had shown him the notation system. By mid-morning, Perry had a written system that would survive his absence. That afternoon I organized a coordinated raid on the nearest hidden depot. Hollis knew which wolves in the valley could be trusted. I knew the depot's location from the survey coordinates. We took 11 people, 3 carts, and an extremely specific plan built on the assumption that the depot guards were not soldiers but hired laborers who had been paid to look the other way rather than fight. The assumption held. We recovered enough grain to feed Hollow Creek and 2 neighboring settlements through the remainder of winter. Then the depot's rear door opened and 6 armed men stepped through it and the assumption stopped holding. I grabbed a collapsed shelf unit as cover and started calculating angles. The dust in a grain depot at this concentration was flammable under certain conditions. The entrance was behind us. The guards were in a loose formation that suggested training but not recent practice. I was building the sequence in my head when the rear wall came in. Madden entered first, sword drawn, and he moved like a man who had been running on no sleep and pure terror for a week and had finally found the thing he was running toward. He killed the man coming at my back before I registered the threat. I stood in the grain dust with my stolen coat covered in it and looked at Madden Kincaid for the first time since I heard him call me a price. His hands were shaking. Chapter 5. The fight cleared in under 4 minutes. Triplet handled the left side of the depot with the focused efficiency of a man who had set his personality completely aside, which was actually more alarming than the armed opposition. Coulter moved through the right flank without a word, disabled 2 guards with joint locks rather than blades, and positioned himself between the rear door and the settlement wolves before anyone had to ask. When it was over, the dust settled and the grain bags sat in shafted morning light and nobody moved for a moment. Hollis was the first to speak. She looked at the 3 Kincaid Alphas standing in her recovered grain depot and said, "Are these yours?" I said, "Contractually, temporarily, and with significant asterisks, yes." Triplet looked at my face and his expression did something complicated that was not quite guilt and not quite relief and landed somewhere between them that I did not have a name for. Coulter was looking at the bruise along my left cheekbone from a shelf corner I had met earlier at Speed. He looked at it the way he looked at ledger entries that did not reconcile, like it was a problem he had already solved and the solution was something he was not going to say out loud yet. Madden stepped toward me. "You left without a guard," he said. The audacity was actually impressive. "I left without permission," I said. The guard situation was the least of the gaps in your oversight. He stopped 2 feet from me, close enough that his cedar smoke scent hit my wolf like a hand pressed flat against a bruise, present and unavoidable and deeply unwelcome given the circumstances. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing they sometimes did in the supply meetings I attended before Marlowe started locking doors early, that focused, pressurized attention that made a person feel like the only variable in the room worth solving for. I had once found it flattering. Right now it made me want to sit him down and explain to him at length how flattering attention was not a substitute for basic human accountability. Triplet said my name. He said it quietly, none of the performance in his voice, just the syllables, and I kept my eyes on Madden because if I looked at Triplet while he was being genuine, I was going to lose about 30 seconds of necessary anger. Madden said, "Let me explain." "You can explain," I said. "I will tell you in advance that I have spent the last 24 hours reading financial documents that put your explanation in some context. So the bar for what counts as a satisfying reason is currently quite high." They explained. Marlowe had brought the forged letters to Madden 3 days before I left. Letters written in my hand, or something close enough to my hand that Madden had believed them, describing a plan to use the mating bond as legal leverage to transfer Kincaid territory management to an Ash Ridge coalition after Jory Quinn restarted hostilities. There was supporting documentation, intercepted correspondence, a witness account from a border scout who had apparently seen me meeting with Ash Ridge agents. The scout was one of Marlowe's hired men. I had not known that then. The night I overheard the library conversation, Madden had been 3 days inside a fear he had not known how to name. He had laughed at the idea of me wanting a council seat because laughing had been easier than admitting he was terrified of a person who had quietly become the most important presence in his life, and that the letters might be real. Triplet had laughed because Madden was laughing and because Triplet had never learned how to hold space for his own fear without deflecting it sideways into performance. Coulter had said what he said because silence had already cost him more than he had planned to admit, and by the time the library conversation happened, silence had become a habit he could not break quickly enough. I listened to all of this. Then I said, "You had a question and I was in the building." Nobody spoke. "You had 3 days with letters that claimed I was planning something harmful." I was in the building. "You could have asked me." Madden said, "I know. You did not ask me," I said. "You discussed my life with Marlowe. You decided what I was worth. And you did it in a room where the door was 3 inches open because it did not occur to any of you that I might be in the hallway, because it did not occur to any of you that I moved through this building the way a person moves through a place they live in. Because you never fully believed I lived there." The grain dust moved in the light. Triplet's throat worked. Coulter said, "That is accurate." I looked at him. Coulter met my eyes without flinching, which I noted despite myself. "I suspected the letters were inconsistent," Coulter said. "The date notation on 2 documents did not match your territorial registration period." I did not say so. Why? It was not a question. He heard that. "Because saying so would have required me to tell Madden he was wrong," Coulter said. "And I chose not to fracture that. I chose the easier thing." I looked at the 3 of them for a long moment. "Here is what I am willing to do," I said. "I will help you expose Marlowe. I will give you access to everything I have documented. But I am not returning to Kestrel Hall as your bonded mate. I am returning as the elected representative of these settlements, with my own authority, my own movements, and a written agreement that no alpha touches me or scent marks me without my explicit permission. All evidence goes to an outside tribunal. And if your signatures appear on fraudulent orders, and Madden, yours do appear on fraudulent orders, you accept the tribunal's jurisdiction." Madden said, "Where do I sign?" I pulled a blank page from my coat pocket and a pen from behind my ear. He signed it before I finished writing. Triplet signed second, quieter than usual, no joke at the ready. Coulter signed last, pressed the pen back into my hand and held it 1 second longer than necessary. I took the page and folded it once. "Marlowe is going to announce I was kidnapped by Ash Ridge extremists," I said. "He has probably already sent the statement," Triplet said. "He sent it this morning." "Good," I said. Then my father is already traveling to Kestrel Hall to testify against me. Nobody spoke. My father, I said, is the man who signed the first diversion order. Chapter 6. Nobody in that depot made a sound for a full 5 seconds after I said my father's name. Truett's mouth opened and closed once. Coulter's grip on the pen he was still holding tightened until the wood creaked. Madden looked at me with the expression of a man watching the floor drop out from under a building he had believed was stable. I gave them the silence. They had earned the discomfort of it. Then I laid the feed inventory sheet on the nearest grain bag and walked them through every line. My father's signature on the first diversion order. The quarterly payments. The mineral corridor access agreement. The forged identification codes using my treaty registration headers on documents dated before I ever crossed into Kincaid territory. The full construction of a fraud that had kept a war running for an extra year while families buried their dead and settlements like Hollow Creek boiled roots to feed their children. Madden read without speaking. His jaw worked once like he was going to say something and then he decided against it, which was the most emotionally intelligent thing I had seen him do in 6 months. Truett sat down on a grain bag. Not dramatically. Just sat down like his legs made a quiet, private decision. Coulter asked me 2 clarifying questions about the date notation system, and when I answered both correctly from memory, he folded his hands and looked at the ceiling for 4 seconds. Hollis stood near the door and said nothing because she had already known most of this for months and had simply been waiting for someone with enough access to connect the pieces. I told them what I needed from them, not what I wanted. Not what my wolf was doing in my chest every time cedar smoke hit the back of my throat. Not the part where Coulter had held the pen against my fingers 1 second too long and something in me had catalogued the warmth of it against my will. What I needed was operational. The distributed document plan required trusted couriers in territories where Kincaid riders would be recognized and stopped. Truett's diplomatic network was the only infrastructure that could move paper between settlements fast enough. Truett looked up from the grain bag. Done, he said. No joke. No performance. Just the word. Coulter said he had a contact inside the regional records office who could certify document authenticity without routing the certification through Marlowe's committee. Madden said he would pull his personal authorization from every active supply order pending independent review, which would freeze roughly 40% of Marlowe's operational budget by morning. I told him that would alert Marlowe immediately. Madden said, "Good." I looked at him. He said, "I want him to know we are coming. I want him to spend every hour between now and the tribunal understanding exactly what he built and watching it come apart." That was the first time since the library that I felt something toward Madden Kincaid that was not categorized under fury. I did not let it show, but I felt it. We worked through the afternoon and into evening, spread across Hollis's mill with her hot water and Perry's careful handwriting pressed into service as a courier ledger. Truett dictated to Perry with genuine patience, adjusting his vocabulary when Perry's pen hesitated, never once making the boy feel slow. I watched that without meaning to. Filed it in the same place I had filed the pen warmth and the way Madden had stepped between me and the threat before he even registered he was doing it. My father sent a message through a Kincaid border station at dusk. It was addressed to the tribunal administrator, not to me. Formal language, controlled and precise. It announced that Jory Quinn, former Alpha of Ash Ridge, was prepared to offer testimony regarding the criminal conduct of his son Baylor Quinn in the matter of the engineered relief diversion. Perry brought me the transcript. I read it once. My father had not simply turned against me to protect himself. The testimony was too detailed. The framing was too specific. He had been preparing this statement for months, which meant he had always planned to use it, which meant the offer he had made to me through Hollis, return home and blame the Kincaids, had never been a real offer. It had been a test to see if I would take a visible position that made me easier to discredit. I set the transcript face down on the table. Coulter was already looking at me. He did not ask. He waited. "Marlowe is going to burn the regional archive," I said. "He sent his team north this morning. We have until midnight." Coulter said quietly, "How do you know?" I turned the transcript over and pointed to the border station timestamp. The message had been routed through the archive building's internal courier system. The routing stamp showed a second destination code running parallel. a location code that matched one of the abandoned depot coordinates from the Prairie Draw maps. The archive building had a fire set inside it already, waiting for a signal. Chapter 7. We left Hollis's mill at 9 and moved fast. Coulter had already copied the critical ledger pages and distributed the sets between 4 separate couriers heading to 4 separate settlements before I finished pulling Truett's coat back on. He had done it quietly, without announcing the plan, which meant he had started copying the moment I mentioned the archive an hour earlier. He had anticipated the move and acted without waiting for consensus, and I processed that information somewhere between useful and devastating because it meant Coulter had been capable of this the entire time. The archive building was 3 miles northeast on the Ridge Road. We went through the tree line parallel to the road in a group of 7, counting Hollis, Perry, and 2 settlement wolves named Dara and Cole, who refused to stay behind and had better cold weather gear than any of us. The storm came in from the north while we moved. Real mountain weather, not dramatic timing. Ice in the wind, visibility dropping, the kind of cold that gets inside a coat and stays there. Truett moved up beside me without comment and blocked the wind from my left side, which was where the gap in the coat collar let the worst of it through. He did not make it a gesture. He just moved and stayed there. I let him. The archive building was a converted mill structure, 2 stories, stone foundation, wood upper level full of 23 years of territorial records. I could see from the road that the interior windows had a light source that was not electrical. The building had no power on the emergency grid after midnight. Someone had already started it. Madden looked at me. I pointed to the east entrance, which the original survey map showed connected to the records room by the shortest internal path. Cole and Dara took the exterior perimeter. Truett went to the ground floor storage where Marlowe's agents would have positioned themselves to watch the exits. Madden and I went in through the east door together. The smoke was low and controlled, accelerant-fed, the kind designed to build slowly and look accidental from outside until it was too large to stop. The records room was on the 2nd floor. I went up the stairs at a run with Madden 1 step behind and found 4 settlement witnesses tied to chairs along the far wall, coughing, alive, and extremely unhappy. Madden cut the restraints. I pulled the nearest witness up and pointed at the door, and the man moved without needing a second instruction because smoke is a universal motivator. The record shelves were already burning on the south wall. I grabbed what I could reach: bound ledger books, rolled survey documents, a locked box I pulled off a shelf by the handle without breaking stride. The heat was building fast. My eyes were streaming. I could hear Madden behind me pulling witnesses toward the stairs, and his voice, steady and low, telling them exactly where to put their feet. The south wall section collapsed. It went down toward me rather than away, which was the kind of structural behavior that a better designed morning would not have included. I moved left and the burning shelf edge caught the back of Truett's coat, and I spun and hit the floor and rolled and came up with the coat smoking, and my left palm burned along the heel where I had caught myself. Coulter came through the window. He came through the 2nd floor window from an external ladder that he had apparently located, positioned, and climbed in the time it took the shelf to fall, which suggested he had mapped the building exterior before we entered, which I added to the growing document of things Coulter did silently that I had not known to notice. He crossed the room, picked up the documents I had dropped, tucked them inside his jacket, and grabbed my burned hand without looking at it and pulled me toward the window. "The stairs are blocked," he said. "I noticed," I said. We went out the window. The rain outside hit like a reset. Cold and complete and indiscriminate. I stood in the mud with smoke in my hair and a burned palm and a stolen coat that had seen better decades, and looked at the building taking itself apart in fire and water. Years of records. Gone. Madden reached me first. He was breathing hard and his side was wet in a way that was darker than rain, but he was standing and he put both hands on my face the way someone checks that a thing is real, present, and not damaged beyond repair. I let him. Then I looked at Coulter's jacket. "How many pages did you get out?" Coulter opened his jacket. The copied ledgers were dry. "Enough," he said. Madden dropped his hands from my face. I watched his expression shift when I looked at him directly, and I said, quietly, "Show me the wound." He had not mentioned it. He would not have mentioned it. Chapter 8. The wound was a knife cut along his left side. Deep enough to need binding, but not deep enough to be the thing that ended the night. I knew the difference. I had triaged field injuries during the siege when the Ash Ridge medics were overwhelmed and decisions had to be made fast and with whatever cloth was closest. I tore a strip from the inside lining of Truett's coat, which the coat had at this point more than earned the sacrifice, and pressed it firm against Madden's ribs while he stood against the exterior wall of the archive and looked at the burning building with an expression that had stopped pretending to be in control. He said, "I signed them." I kept pressure on the wound. He said, "Every fraudulent order that passed through emergency authorization during the last 8 months of the war. I signed blank headers because Marlowe told me the territory needed speed, and I believed him because he had never given me a reason not to, and because I was 26 years old running a war and I wanted someone I trusted to be right about something." "I know," I said. "That makes me responsible." "Yes," I said. "It does." He looked at me then. Actually looked at me, not at the version of me he was managing or protecting or negotiating with. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they are genuinely afraid of losing and have run out of ways to pretend otherwise. I tied off the binding. Truett and Coulter had moved the witnesses to the settlement cart. Perry had the horse. Dara and Cole were watching the road. We had approximately 90 minutes before Marlowe's team would realize the fire had been interrupted and send confirmation back to the Chancellor that the night had not gone as planned. I said, "The tribunal is in 4 days. Madden said, "I will submit my signatures voluntarily." Truett had come back without my hearing him. He stood 6 feet away in the rain, his diplomatic coat ruined and his hair flattened and his expression stripped of every deflection I had ever seen him use. He said, "Baylor, I need to say something and I need you to let me say it without making it easier for me." I waited. "I laughed," he said, "because I was scared. Not of you, of what you were to me after 5 months. I had never wanted anyone to stay before. I did not know what to do with it, so I made it a joke in a room where I thought you could not hear me, and I was wrong about every part of that sentence." I looked at him for a long moment. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me," I told him. "I know," he said. "I practiced it 14 times on the ride here. My chest did something against my direct instructions." Coulter appeared at my right shoulder. He held out the bound copies without preamble. "We need to redistribute these tonight before Marlowe realizes what survived the fire." We worked until nearly dawn in the back room of a settlement house 2 miles from the archive, separating the copied documents into sealed packets addressed to 6 village council representatives, 2 independent territorial judges, and 1 regional record keeper in the Eastern District who Coulter had apparently been cultivating as a contact for 3 years because Coulter was the kind of person who maintained relationships with archivists as a strategic precaution, which I found both impressive and personally relevant. At some point between the 5th and 6th packet, Madden's shoulder pressed against mine at the table and stayed there. Not demanding, just present. I did not move away. Truett fell asleep sitting up against the wall at around 3 in the morning, and Coulter covered him with the one dry blanket in the room without waking him, and then came back to the table and sat across from me and said, very quietly, "My silence cost you more than Madden's signature did." His negligence was systemic. Mine was personal. I saw what they were doing to you in those meetings, and I chose the path that kept my brothers comfortable. I set down my pen. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve the accurate version of events," he said. "And because I am done choosing the easier thing." Outside, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle. Perry was asleep on a bench by the door. The fire in the grate had burned low. The next morning, the tribunal administrator received all 6 packets simultaneously. For hours later, he received a 7th document that none of us had sent. It was a certified filing from Jory Quinn's legal representative. My father had submitted my childhood signature as the primary authorization on the original diversion order. The tribunal formally named me as the lead suspect before the first witness was called. Chapter 9. The tribunal hall was cold the way official buildings are always cold. Like warmth is a privilege that requires paperwork. I walked in wearing borrowed clothes because everything I owned was either at Kestrel Hall or smoke damaged, which meant I stood before a panel of 5 judges in a gray wool jacket that was slightly too wide in the shoulders and boots that actually matched, a personal improvement over my situation 1 week ago. Madden walked on my left, Truett on my right, Coulter 1 step behind, which was where he always positioned himself when he was prepared to move fast. The tribunal administrator read the formal charge summary without looking up from his document. The crowd in the gallery was large. Settlement representatives, Kincaid territorial officials, border community elders, and 3 rows of people I did not recognize who had the coordinated stillness of people placed there for a purpose. Marlowe sat at the respondents' table in a charcoal suit. He looked like a man attending a ceremony he had organized, confident in the specific way people are confident when they believe they have already won. Coulter presented the copied ledgers first. He walked the tribunal through the route numbers, the coordinate system, the 14-month diversion timeline with the precision of someone who had been building this presentation in his head for days. He cited document numbers. He cross-referenced authentication certificates from the Eastern District record keeper. He answered every procedural challenge from Marlowe's legal representative without breaking stride. Triplet presented the forged correspondence. He had the original letters Marlowe had shown the triplets, the ones purportedly in my handwriting, displayed beside authenticated samples of my actual correspondence from the treaty period. He had found a document examiner in the Eastern settlements who had certified the inconsistencies in ink composition and letter spacing within 48 hours. The forgery was thorough, but it had been produced quickly, and quick forgeries leave pressure differences in the pen strokes. I presented the diversion mechanism. I stood at the evidence table and walked through exactly how the system worked, settlement by settlement, receipt by receipt, false coordinate by false coordinate. I kept my voice level. I kept my hands still. I spoke to the settlement representatives in the gallery as much as to the judges because the people who had lived inside this theft deserved to hear it explained plainly by someone who understood what it had cost them. Then my father walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he would not meet my eyes, which told me everything about how certain he was that his testimony was going to land the way Marlowe had promised him it would. Jory Quinn took the witness position and delivered his prepared statement in a steady voice. His son had designed the diversion system. His son had used the peace negotiation period to embed fraudulent authorization codes. His son had manipulated the triplet alphas through the bonding arrangement to delay investigation. He had the childhood signature on the original order to prove it. The gallery shifted. I let him finish. Then I stood up and I submitted 3 documents that I had not shown anyone yet. Not the triplets, not Hollis, not Coulter. The first was a certified land survey from 14 months before the war's final year, showing that the mineral corridor access rights my father had sold to Marlowe were not his to sell. They belonged to the Ash Ridge Community Collective, not the Alpha's personal estate. My father had committed fraud against his own pack before he committed it against anyone else. The second was a financial record from my father's private account, obtained from a border banking cooperative that Jory Quinn had used believing it was unaffiliated with any territorial authority. It was affiliated with the Eastern District Record Keeper's Office, which Coulter had known for 3 years. The third was the original diversion order with my childhood signature. I submitted it alongside my actual age documentation from that period. I had been 11 years old when that order was supposedly signed. The treaty registration that assigned me an identification code did not exist until I was 24. My father had forged a signature I could not have made. The gallery went completely silent. Then Marlowe stood up and his legal representative put a hand on his arm and he shook it off and he looked at me across the room with an expression that had finally dropped every layer of performance and was simply rage, clear and unmanaged. He said, "You were supposed to disappear." He said it to the whole room, out loud. His legal representative closed his eyes. Madden removed his ruling insignia and set it on the table before the tribunal administrator could ask for it. Triplet surrendered his diplomatic credentials. Coulter placed the Intelligence Archive access card in front of the senior judge and stepped back. The tribunal convened immediately. Marlowe's armed supporters moved first. 12 men in the gallery, positioned along 3 rows, reaching for weapons beneath their coats. Every village representative in the room reached into their own coats simultaneously and pulled out a sealed copy of the complete evidence set. Marlowe could burn 1 document. He could not burn 60 people's memory. The courthouse guards responded before a single shot was fired. In the chaos, Jory Quinn ran. Coulter had already anticipated that. Chapter 10. Coulter had positioned Cole and Dara at both courthouse exits before the tribunal opened. My father made it 11 steps into the eastern corridor before Cole stepped out of a doorway and blocked the path with the calm immovability of someone who had been told exactly where to stand and had simply stood there. Jory Quinn was returned to the tribunal hall in handcuffs and did not speak again for the remainder of the proceedings. The verdicts came down over 3 days. Marlowe was convicted on all charges: conspiracy, engineered famine, attempted murder for the arrow that had been traced back to a hired contractor on his personal payroll, treason against the territorial government he had served for 19 years. The sentencing stripped him of every title, every asset, every contract benefit he had accumulated during the fraud period. The Kincaid Treasury absorbed the recovered funds under independent administration, and the first disbursement went directly to widow compensation for the families of wolves killed in the war's manufactured final year. Jory Quinn was convicted of fraud against his own community collective, falsification of documents, and criminal conspiracy. He lost the Ash Ridge Alpha title, which passed to a community-elected council, which was honestly an improvement by several measurable standards. The triplets faced the independent investigation I had written into the agreement. Madden's case was the most serious. His blank emergency authorizations had legally enabled the diversion system even though he had not known what they were enabling. The tribunal spent 6 days on it. I did not testify in his defense. I submitted the accurate documentary record and let the judges read it without my interpretation. The ruling was that Madden bore administrative responsibility without criminal intent. He was removed from direct governing authority for 1 year and placed under civilian oversight while the supply network was rebuilt. He accepted the judgment the same way he had signed the agreement in the grain depot, first and without negotiation. Truett's diplomatic immunity was formally suspended pending a conduct review. The review found no criminal involvement but documented a pattern of using procedural distance to avoid accountability. The recommendation was mandatory participation in victim impact sessions with the settlement communities. Truett attended every single one and did not make a single joke in any of them until the 3rd session, when a settlement elder made one first and Truett laughed with visible relief and the elder laughed back and something thawed that had needed thawing. Coulter's intelligence archive was placed under independent civilian review. He designed the review board himself, built in explicit protections against the kind of unilateral decision-making that had allowed Marlowe to operate unchecked, and then submitted himself to the board's oversight like everyone else. I became the elected Dawn Steward of the Border Settlement Coalition 4 months after the trial, which was a title the communities invented specifically because there was no existing title for what I was doing and they wanted the paperwork to reflect reality. I kept working. The triplets courted me properly for a year. Not dramatically. There was no grand gesture campaign. Madden asked permission before every visit to the settlements and showed up with useful things instead of flowers. Updated survey maps, certified supply reports, once a correctly functioning cartwheel because Perry had mentioned the settlement's primary cart was riding uneven and Madden had remembered. Truett sent letters. Real ones, handwritten, that actually said things. He was a better writer than speaker when he was not performing. The letters were funny and honest and occasionally mortifying in their accuracy about his own failures, which was a kind of courage I had not expected from him and respected more than I could easily say. Coulter visited less frequently but stayed longer. He would sit across from me while I worked and read his own reports and occasionally say something that turned out to be exactly the question I had been turning over for 3 days. He never rushed me toward an answer. The renewed mating ceremony was small. 12 people. The settlement elder who had made Truett laugh. Hollis and Perry. Dara and Cole. An independent witness from the tribunal office. Madden dissolved the original treaty bond publicly and formally before asking me to consider a new one. He read the dissolution statement himself in front of the witnesses, and his voice did not waver, which cost him more than it looked like it cost him. I know because I was watching his hands. I chose Truett first, which surprised him enough that he forgot to perform his reaction, and the real one underneath was soft and unguarded and completely worth seeing. I chose Coulter second. He nodded once, and his scent shifted toward me in a way that said everything he had spent a year learning to say out loud. I made Madden wait an additional 30 seconds purely on principle. Then I chose him too. Their scents settled around me, cedar and winter rain and smoked maple, and my black plum filled the space between them and marked all three without being asked because my wolf had apparently been ready to do that since a grain depot in the middle of a crisis and had simply been waiting for the rest of me to catch up. A year after the trial, I returned to Kestrel Hall. Not as a guest, not as a returning mate, as the Dawn Steward of the Border Settlement Coalition, arriving with my own authority, my own people, and my own purpose, which I set down in that hall the way you set down something you built yourself and carried a long way to put exactly where you intended. Madden called it coming home. I corrected him. I did not come back as their peace offering. I came back as the man all three of them finally learned how to deserve. The lesson in all of this is simple, and it does not require tragedy to understand, only honesty. People who love us can still fail us. Their fear may explain the wound, but it cannot close it. Accountability is not a speech. It is what a person does after the speech is over, in the ordinary days when no one is watching and the work is not dramatic. Love that cannot survive being questioned was never the kind that was worth keeping. And an apology without changed behavior is just a more elaborate way of asking the injured person to carry the weight alone. Redemption is not a destination. It is the choice a person makes every morning to be different from what they were the day before, for no reason except that it is the right thing to do. That is the story. That is all of it. If the story moved something in you, if it made you feel seen or reminded you that you deserve people who do the work to keep you, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that is built to matter. Drop a comment below and tell us which character you connected with most, because your voice in this community inspires the next story more than you know. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We will see you in the next one.